What's going on, guys? I'm Tyler, and I'm very late to the party on this because this came out in 2019, but since I actually missed a shit ton of 2019 movies anyways, I'm here to let you know that Dragged Across Concrete is no perfect movie. And it follows two cops, played by Mel Gibson and Vince Vaughn, who are suspended from the police force for being caught on camera being unnecessarily rough. And since they're both in desperate need of money, they decide to stake out and potentially rob a crime boss that's recently moved to their city. But things get complicated once they realize why this boss is here, and worst of all, just how brutal his crewmates are. And I was waiting for this movie to come out in theaters without even having seen a trailer because I saw a promo on YouTube that had a picture of Mel Gibson and Vince Vaughn, and I'm like, didn't they work together on Hacksaw Ridge? And I'm like, they're making a crime movie with the dude who directed Bone Tomahawk, and I'm like, sign me up for that. I'm all for it. And then it never came to theaters, at least none of the theaters by my city. It came out in theaters and VOD on the same day, which isn't always a good sign, and I didn't actually know that until I saw a Blu-ray at Walmart while waiting for another movie to start. And I'm like, maybe I'll check that out on VOD when I get home. I did, and for hours after watching the movie, I just kept thinking, and I'm like, screw it. I'm going to go back to Walmart and I'm going to go get that Blu-ray. And I'm glad I did, because as really damn slow as this movie can be, it, for whatever reason, well, not for whatever reason, it fascinates me. For starters, all the actors do a really good job at portraying so much emotion with very little. All these characters who are either criminals or cops, they react to all these horrific, violent scenarios in a surprisingly nonchalant way, and it actually does say a lot about them in terms of the nature of their careers. Mel Gibson, especially, is probably the most stone-faced because he has the most experience seeing all this dark shit. And weirdly enough, his soft line delivery actually makes it seem even harsher when he expresses the fact that the world is not as great of a place as we want it to be, and how much it frustrates him whenever people bring politics into his work and supposedly discipline him for not doing his job in a polite way. You obviously don't agree with him slamming a guy's face into concrete, of course, but if he sees a suspect and that suspect might be armed, you can at least understand why he's not going to take any chances. Vince Vaughn, as his partner, is also a little bit jaded from the things that he's seen as a cop and a military sniper, but because he's younger and less experienced, he has seemingly much more optimism and more faith in his job as a police officer, and the tension between the two of them as partners really comes down to questions like, why don't they just send an anonymous tip to the cops? Why don't they apprehend this boss themselves? They could be redeemed by the media, by the police force, feel gratified by themselves personally, or whether or not robbing these gangsters not only disciplines them in a way by robbing their money and having no recourse, but also giving these officers what they consider to be proper compensation for their poor wages. There are no easy answers in this movie, and that's one of the things that makes it so uncompromising, but respectfully uncompromising. For starters, the violence in this movie is entertaining, intense, and really well handled in a realistic way. As Craig Zahler films all of these scenarios in really steady wide shots, he has this kind of Ryan Coogler thing where the situations are gritty, but the camera work, the choppy editing or shaky cam, that's not what makes it gritty. The scenarios themselves are gritty, but the steady filmography, the steady photography for sure, makes it seem so fluid and artistic. And whenever something especially violent happens, Zahler makes the wise choice to never let it linger. As soon as someone is shot in the face, blood is splattered all over the place, it immediately cuts away to the shooter or to a bystander who saw it to make it seem sudden and shocking, but never lingers on the violence itself to the point where the blood and guts become exploitative. But easily the most uncompromising thing about this movie for sure is how offside everyone's beliefs in this movie are. The movie never picks a side with their characters politically. There are conservative characters like Mel Gibson who refuse to adapt with the times and feel like they're being unnecessarily judged for it. There are liberal characters who have semi-conservative beliefs, and it really pisses them off and makes them feel a little self-loathing. Like Mel Gibson's wife, she claims she's as liberal as any ex-cop can be, and she knows that it's racist to think that black people are criminals, but she can't help herself from feeling that way because black kids in her neighborhood are assaulting her daughter on a semi-regular basis. None of the characters in this movie are inherently evil, but because life has dealt them a really shitty hand, their way of dealing with it is by lashing out towards others. Like, there's one criminal in this movie whose dad ran off on his family for another man, and that's exactly why he's homophobic, as opposed to most movies about hatred that focus on why it's good to be accepting and loving to others, which is obviously a really good message. By focusing solely on that, the movies get really repetitive, and if you're already on the movie side with that, you're not going to learn anything new, and you're just going to say, seen it before, seen it done better. And if you're an asshole who hates the message of the movie already, you're either not going to pay attention to it, or you're going to blindly go see it and say, this sucks, I hate it. So, in the long run, not really accomplishing that much. This movie asks the really tough question of, if we are too afraid to try to learn or understand where the hatred comes from, how are we going to evolve as a society? How are we going to change ourselves? As for side characters, there aren't that many that are in more than one or two scenes. Like Don Johnson and Jennifer Carpenter, I don't know why their names are like the most thrown out in the trailers, because Johnson's only in that one scene, and Carpenter is the type of side character who's usually in the background until something really intense happens, and in order for the villains to show themselves off, they pick the one background character who becomes really essential. But Zahler's writing really makes it seem like every character never really goes to waste. Johnson, in the one scene as Gibson and Vaughn's superior, basically privately tells them being called a racist nowadays is like being called a communist in the 50s. And that's the quote that really stuck with me throughout the film. And even if you disagree with that, you can spend some time thinking about it and you can at least understand why anyone would say that. And Carpenter's character is given a backstory that makes the background character all of a sudden becoming the forefront. It makes it seem like you're watching one of those news reports where there's an incident and there's a victim that you hear factoids about and you hear things about them from friends or family members, but you never see their perspective. This movie gives that perspective, so whenever something violent happens to Carpenter's character, it really elevates the stakes. Now, as thought-provoking as the movie is, as well-acted, well-directed, and sharply written as it is, the runtime of 2 hours and 38 minutes really is unnecessary, and it really comes down to how much dialogue there is in this movie. Zahler's idea of making sure no character goes to waste is by having these minute-long monologues of side characters to give off some interesting and semi-funny facts too, and for the sake of world building, because this takes place in an imaginary city where crime is written all over the place, gangsters have these different codes of conduct, different ways of operating without getting caught, and those things were really interesting. But I felt like there were some potential scenes where you could have just told those scenes purely visual, like when Gibson goes to meet a contact, as opposed to arguing for a couple minutes whether or not that contact is there. He can walk up to the person, they can look at each other, and just through close-ups, just for the actor's facial expressions, without talking, you could understand what's about to happen, and it would save a hell of a lot of time. You could make the argument that Zahler was a novelist before being a filmmaker, and that may come from it, which I understand. But he does have scenes in this movie that are purely visual, like when Gibson's daughter does get assaulted and how she deals with that. That scene was done with maybe 1 or 2 lines of talking, and it was one of the best scenes in the movie. Hell, the funniest scene in the movie is just Gibson and Vaughn in a car not talking while Vaughn is munching very loudly on a sandwich and Gibson's just looking the other way going, come on. That bit was funny. And because just the visuals were funny, once Gibson started talking, that just elevated the scene and elevated the humor. There's also some directing techniques that were obviously intentional, but didn't always work as well as I think Zahler was hoping they would. For starters, as opposed to cutting back and forth between actors for close ups, he has Gibson and Vaughn react to certain violent things in wide shots where you can both see their reactions and their expressions to the given moment. And sometimes it works, but because these characters aren't so nonchalant about their jobs and about how horrible the world is, and because most of these shots linger on for longer periods of time, the reactions don't really have that lasting of an effect as I think they were hoping it would. And Zahler has this one technique that usually I'm a big fan of, is when the music in the movie never comes from a soundtrack. It's never purely existing to us as the audience. The music comes within the scene from like a car radio or from someone busking on the street. Sometimes it works in this movie and it leads to some jazz and R&B that fits the film noir style that he's going for, but again, like when it's just Gibson and Vaughn in a car, which is the majority of the movie if I'm being completely honest, all the empty space just makes you acknowledge the fact that there really isn't that much going on. It's not like No Country for Old Men or Portrait of a Lady on Fire, where there are a lot of emotions happening at once during each scene. This movie's a lot more meditative, a lot more thoughtful, and sometimes it does weigh the movie down, but in the long run, Dragged Across Concrete is as brutal as the title would say, and it's as painfully long as the title itself. But I gotta give it to S. Craig Zahler as a filmmaker. Mel Gibson, Vince Vaughn do some of their best performances. Don Johnson, Jennifer Carpenter make the most of the little time they're given. And I didn't talk about him that much in this video because Tory Kittles is really the standout in this movie. And if I said anything else about him, it would go into spoiler territory because he's probably the most mysterious character in the movie. Aside from being sidetracked, the direction, the writing, the performances, the cinematography, just how well the violence is handled in a realistic but still entertaining level, I'm glad I own Dragged Across Concrete. And I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5. Guys, thanks as always for watching. If you have seen Dragged Across Concrete, let me know in the comments below what you thought of it. Be sure to stay tuned for more reviews, and be sure to like and subscribe. Take care.